All right, so this is part three, categories of design. And I want to talk today how we turn all of that history and pieces and bits and bobs that we talked about into our present design aesthetic and how we turn that into something that we use. And the way we look at how all of our historical types of design translate into our current design is through six really kind of ways. And the skene, facade, backdrop type of scenery, wing and drop scenery, wagon or pageant scenery, a box set, which could also be a unit set, a multi-unit set, and we'll talk about what with phases means, and then a suggested or an abstract set. Now, there isn't really a specific list that exists. This is a list I have created out of the history of scenery for you guys, but the terms that we use are still mostly what most people are going to know. So the skene, or sometimes called backdrop scenery, or I like to call facade scenery, is where you have that non-scenery scenery, that one big piece of scenery, that one big facade, that one big building, that one flat thing, so just a backdrop or something on stage. And that kind of scenery is going to have a lot of flat space using existing architecture. And it translates a lot today to what we call ballet masking, which is where you have, it's often used for dance shows or shows which have very little need for scenery and a lot of need for movement. The ballet masking is often used in ballets, and it's the idea of the black masking being cut to basically the proscenium line and just straight masking that will hide the wings but not take away a lot of stage space, creating a big open square, and a cyc or backdrop in the back in order to light a good distance scenery. They also, if you're talking about dance, they often have lighting instruments and the like in those wings. But it's usually just one backdrop. Then you have wing and drop, the kind of, cutting edge 16th century technology where we're using wings and drops to create a picture. And these are much more likely to have some internal 3D things in them than maybe just that backdrop idea. But in modern applications, both of them will exist with three-dimensional pieces of scenery in addition. The wing and drop idea may or may not include perspective scenery. Traditionally, an employed elaborate perspective, and of course, it's from kind of originating from that Renaissance era. You also have wagon or pageant scenery, which we kind of talked about being independent units, traveled entire environments for each scene. We see this in Passion plays, but today it might translate to haunted houses, or it could kind of move into the idea of that Shakespearean-esque single pageant house, or the multi-set idea of Broadway theater. So when you look at the three on the right, wing and drop pageant scenery and a regular facade or a backdrop scenery is considered ancient types of scenery. This is considered scenery that is in the past. And on the right side, a unit set, a multi-unit set, or suggested, that was my cat throwing things at you, a box set or a unit set, a multi-unit set, and a suggested abstract set are considered the types of scenery that are in the United Scenic Artists Guide for pay structure. So these are the three types or kinds of scenery that are really acknowledged and thought of as today. And if you think about it, backdrop scenery is kind of a single unit. Wing and drop scenery is probably considered around masking and could be considered a single unit set. And wagon scenery would be something like multi-set scenery. So the enclosed area with walls around it, one of which is open to the proscenium and is primarily a realistic set, is a box set. It's a single unit that's primarily realistic. It translates really well to realistic dramas today, as well as TVs and sitcoms. But anything that is a unit set or one particular item, if it's not realistic, still a unit set. So you have the traditional box set, but you could also have just a single unit abstract set could be considered a unit set if it's not too far off from an interior. If we're living in a cave and we don't move to any other areas and it's not particularly abstract, it could certainly be a unit set that's not a box set and still get unit set type pricing for the union. Multi-set or units set. So here's where it gets a little weird, is that some contracts call it a units set and some call a unit set a multi-set. So a unit set could be, is often considered a box set, but sometimes a unit set is a set created from many units. So it's sometimes worth clarifying if it's a multi-unit set or a single unit set, because there are different areas of the country where those are not congruent. But a multi-unit set composed of yet many units is often used in musicals, is what we would see in it. And it's also supported by drops, backdrop cycs, projection surfaces, scrims, and masking or legs. And this can also be called a unit with phases. So in the pricing structure from the union, currently, you can also have a unit with a couple of changes in it. So mostly a unit with a few small changes in it, and still incur extra design fee without getting really high in the pricing bracket of a multi-set unit set. Because that kind of pricing bracket is designed for Broadway, which has a lot more money for their designers, and expect a lot more, where regional theater that only has one or two scene transitions and it's not a musical doesn't want to pay musical high prices for their designer. So there is a unit set with phases, just means it has fewer units than a musical might have. And again, that could be many, many units. You can see from this example of Legally Blonde, you have anything from very elaborate units to the two on the right, where you have the sorority house and then another piece of the sorority house with some more scenery in it, might be considered a phase of that unit. So the designer wouldn't get a separate design fee for adding a second scene. That's part of the same scene, that's part of the same phase of that set. But they get an entire different chunk of change for the set next to it, where we're at the beauty salon. And that's all part of the pricing negotiation of their contract. With a musical, it's about how many scenes there are and how many different things they have to design. So that's part of that unionized contract. But it's a lot more work, you can see, than a single box set is involved, right? So once you get away from this kind of multi-set unit, you also have a suggested or an abstract unit. And this could be suggested as in symbolism or expressionism or modernism, where you have one small thing just suggesting a world, like you could have a cube represent both a chair in one scene, a table in another scene, and a base of a statue in another scene. This item is symbolizing or representing a bunch of different pieces, and it could be very simple or very elaborate depending on the kind of symbolism that there is. There is a pretty famous version of Hamlet where the set is an entire skull, a gigantic skull, and it's helping to symbolize that the entire play is inside Hamlet's head. So that is a very strong example of symbolism that isn't a tiny thing that can just be moved around. Expressionism can function in a similar manner. It can be big or it can be small, and it can express a style or it can express an emotion about the play rather than a physical reality. All of these ideas are really hard to pin down. It's basically describing something as not realistic, right? So the box or unit set that's extremely realistic. And a box set is almost universally referring to something as going to be realistic, though it doesn't have to be. You can still have an enclosed box set that's just representational or symbolic. There's a essentially box set for the opera La Traviata that is just a curved white wall with a door in it. And I actually think it has a like one little step around it, so it's like an amphitheater audience seat all the way around, but just one step. And you could walk around on that step. You could jump on it. You could sit on it at any given point, and every character and man, well, every man in the play, it's all men but her, are dressed in black against the white, and she's dressed in bright red against the white. So that is an enclosed area of walls, one of which is open to the proscenium, so it's a box set, but it's not realistic, and it's more suggested or abstract than a box set. So keep in mind that these things interchange a little bit, but when we say box set, we're usually talking about a realistic interior, not a suggested or abstract representation that just happens to be an closed area of walls with one open to the proscenium. Yeah, understand. So the abstract sets can also be supported by drops, backdrop sites, and projections and surfaces. And just because I love this picture, it can be very, very big and very, very elaborate. And it can be very, very small and very, very simple. So when you're talking about the big categories, you have a box interior, multi-set unit, and an abstract representation. And then these three main types can have atmospheres from backdrop scenery, wing and drop scenery, or pageant scenery. And they can also have these essential characteristics transposed back and forth between the styles. All right, but that should give you a place to start. When you're thinking about looking at what scenery can be, these are really some basic structures of what scenery can be. And from there, you can explore what your scenery will be. All right, so currently, when we talk about theater in general, when we talk about designing scenery, there are a couple of things that we want to be able to do. We want to be able to define the performance space, and we want to keep in mind that we are defining the performance space. By that I mean, we're creating a floor plan, we're creating the ground plan or footprint. So we're saying where everything goes, and I do mean everything. We want to control where everything goes, and by doing that, we need to make sure that we're giving careful forethought and providing a flexible opportunity for our directors, and that's really important. We are deciding where the levels of action will be. So when you're creating the opportunity for different pictures, you're creating where the horizontal meets the vertical, and if you create levels, now you're creating vertical diagonals instead of just diagonals that go from downstage to upstage or left to right. You're creating diagonals that go from low on the stage to high on the stage. And changing this level of action is really important to making something look dynamic and getting different pictures. It's also creating depth by giving you some midground, foreground focus area, and background that doesn't distract from the story. So just because you're having an interior scene doesn't mean that your background has to be walls if they're not necessarily important. They can relate to the scene or represent an exterior outside of the house without distracting from the interior. But you have to create that separation so that we don't think that these things are one and the same. It's relatively common to have a Chekhov play take place inside an orchard filled with cherry trees or birch trees or something of the like, some very Russian-looking Russia trees, and have an interior represented on the inside. And using that exterior has been, I guess, a trope or something that people have gone to to really create something interesting happening on stage, because we are in an interior the entire time. Also, the play, it then comes away from creating a brutal internal naturalistic or realistic setting. This depth is created to make a background, but you have to make sure to separate those so we don't feel like instead of sitting in their living room for tea, these people are outside in a forest. And it's important to make that distinction. And again, you're creating all of the blocking opportunities in a play. And you have to do this with care and forethought, and you have to be flexible and talk with your director about it. It's important that you give them options and you make something that your director can work in. You want to create interesting lines for movement, interesting pathways, interesting levels, interesting depth. You need to create all these things with the idea that this play will move. And if you create a bunch of straight lines and you create a bunch of big open empty space with nothing in it, then no one's going to move the long distance to interact with your set or your props. And if you create straight lines, then people are going to stand in straight lines. You are creating what the director has an opportunity to do, and you may be limiting him or her. So keep in mind that some directors like upstage entrances, they like power positions downstage, they like a power position on an elevated platform around mid-stage. There are some directors that absolutely hate having their center stage split apart, and there are some directors that are all down for you moving the most dramatic point of the stage to down right or down left and creating a diagonal in the set that really helps to force perspective to that power point. But some don't. And like any other touchy subject, the best way to find out is to ask. So, actually talk to that person you're supposed to be talking to. You want to have your set also characterize the space, usually. And by that, I mean, usually this place is a place that someone lives or exists. You're creating an interpretive statement. Sorry about that typo, statement of conventions with actors. So you're establishing a convention that these actors can interpret and work with as well. And you're creating it with the actors for the audience to understand. So when you're interpreting a statement, is this actor one's house or actors two house? Is it the character, or is this a place that belongs to Bob, or is this a place that belongs to John? Is this a place that belongs to Sally? Is Sally uncomfortable and not able to be in Bob's apartment? So for that, you need to help by knowing the background, and by background at this time I mean exposition, and you're giving some of that exposition on the character or the scene through your scenery. If Sally is a very clean person and a I forgot my made up names. Bob is a very messy person, then maybe Sally in Bob's apartment is really disgusted by all the stuff everywhere. So you need to put stuff everywhere. Or maybe she doesn't say anything about that, but that's something that comes up later in the play in their relationships. And by making a messy area of the apartment, not only can you give the actor playing Bob some reason to clean up. You might be giving Sally a reason to clean up for him, depending on their relationship. And you're exemplifying Bob's personality and giving Sally an opportunity to display her disgust in that situation and allow the actors to establish a convention with the audience. You're also using it to create mood and atmosphere. We've talked about that a couple times, so I'm going to leave that at that and just stop there. One of the biggest and most important things about your scenery is its movement, and you have a couple of choices. Moving scenery usually involves bringing it in or bringing it out. When we say that, we mean into the scene and out of the scene. So you have a unit, a thing. You could bring it in from the bottom, you could bring it up, you could bring it down in from the top, or you could bring it up from upstage, you could bring it from downstage, upstage, you can bring it in from the left, you can bring it in from the right. a lot of the times that's really the only ways that you can get it on stage. I know I just like blatantly told you some coordinates, coordinal directions for getting on stage, but there isn't a magic solution where there's more than that. It can come in from stage left, stage right, from up from the floor, or down from the ceiling. It can also come from behind scenery, if you move something, so it can come downstage, or it can be hiding in the pit or toward the audience and go upstage. Some other things that are a little bit tricky that you might not realize is it can come from within, behind, or above the audience. And by that, I mean you could have something on stage that's hiding something. So pretty famously, the Mary Poppins house is on stage as an enclosed dollhouse box and then breaks open. So that scenic transition is hidden inside something else. You can also have, some shows have done blooming forests or other types of things that where one transition comes from within another. In that same vein, you can hide one thing behind another, like the in one scenic transitions we discussed in earlier videos, where you're hiding a show drop or a backdrop in a low batten and changing all of the scenery behind that drop and having it revealed in a relatively magical moment. The other thing is, like Mary Poppins, you can fly something out above the audience. They might not be expecting it, or you could, fan of the opera style, drop a chandelier over the audience, or make it feel like it's over the audience, or fly people over them, Spider-Man style. So there are some other options, but that's pretty much scraping the bottom of the barrel. That doesn't mean the ways that you bring things in can't be interesting. How it moves is really important. When something is coming on, does it turn on? Does it slide sideways on? Does it fall smoothly? Does it fall rapidly? Does it free fall? Does it rise up slowly from the floor? Does it turn? Is it laying on the floor and it unfolds like an accordion? Does it happen in sync with something else, or does it happen alone? What do we see when it moves? How something moves can make or break a musical. Musicals are often puzzles, and puzzles that you are trying to solve by trying to figure out what the movement is in order to get those items on stage as efficiently as possible. So when you're thinking about movement and movement for pieces, when you're thinking about your current ideas for designing scenery, you're trying to achieve some things, and you don't want to forget about blocking. You don't want to forget about what the scenery says about the people on stage, and you don't want to forget how something moves into the next scene. That's really important. You don't have a magic wand. You are the magic wand, and you have to solve that problem, and you have to talk about how you want it to get on stage. Is it an entire move? Is it an entire wagon that slides on stage? Is it storable backstage? Is it not? Does it have to go down the floor in an elevator? Do you need a slip stage? It is how you would like this to be used, and also how you choose to make it work. So a slip stage is traditionally used to make a scenic transition, but one of the ways I've seen it used before is it's just essentially a treadmill. So a guy is walking on the slip stage as it moves, and it's a scene that's supposed to be like a TV recording a guy walking in front of a backdrop. And so he's on the slip stage as he's walking along. So the actor's really walking on stage, but from our perspective, he's not going anywhere, which was really effective, but not the traditional use for slip stage. So just because this is, a simple idea of this is how you could move scenery and this is how movement happens, doesn't mean that this is by any way, shape, or form the only options there are. Just a way to help break that down. So by now, you should be pretty well on your way to figuring out how you are going to do, how you could possibly do scenery for your show. Alrighty, until next time.